Thank you, everyone. All right, so as he mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how to assess the maturity of your security program in your organization. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from so you kind of know my perspective on this. I was a developer early in my career. I also worked as a computer virus analyst at Trend Micro for a little while. I've been a technical project manager on a lot of application development efforts, and most recently over the last 5 years or so, I've been focusing on application security and in particular doing governance over our application security team. What that means for me is I've been doing things like leading efforts to roll out some of the OWASP top 10 best practices to our developers and trying to help them figure out how to integrate that into their coding practices, how to do better secure code reviews, how to integrate security into the left of our process so that when releases are planned, they're integrating security, bringing them in earlier and earlier, that kind of thing. And so one of the things I've been doing over the last year is looking at our application security initiative and doing an assessment of the maturity. So I want to share with you some of the lessons we've had about as we've approached this over the last year, trying to figure out how to assess how mature our application security program is and kind of the path we took and some of the lessons we learned there. All right, so first of all, I think one of the most important things is to know why you're trying to assess maturity in your security initiative. So there's lots of good reasons you might be getting into this. You might be saying, how mature is our application security program here? One reason might just be you're trying to figure out where to spend your budget dollars in security in the next year, and you want to know, as you grow, what's a good area, beneficial area to grow into. You might also be asking yourself, like, what kind of gaps do we have? You may not know really. Or you might have some good ideas about where your gaps are and want to confirm your gut about which areas you guys need to be investing in. Another thing, and I think one that this is probably a big driver for us, is that we have some ideas about that we need to grow, and it's about making the case to our senior VP, to our CISO, that it's not just us saying this, that this is kind of an industry best practice, and this really is what other companies are doing. And then you might know you're going to be investing in your initiative and just want to have some hard data to show that you've actually improved. So take a benchmark now, later on you can show that you've improved over time. And then another way this might be helpful for you is if you have a vendor or kind of outside supplier and you want to figure out how mature they are. They're telling you they have a really secure initiative and you want to figure out if that's true. So those are all the good reasons. There are some bad reasons to be assessing your security initiative. One is that you've just been told by them, and that might be an outside consultant who came in and said, hey, go assess your maturity. It might be one of those VPs. They want to do this because they know this is a thing people do, but they're not going to do anything with the results. No point, wasted money. Another reason that's not a great reason to do this is because you just want to get an answer and just do whatever it says. You're not going to evaluate the results or figure out if it's going to fit into your organization. You're just going to go off and say, this is the way to go, without trying to customize it to the area you work. And then another final bad idea is just coming into it with your own idea of what the results are going to be, and then just not letting the answer, not changing that if the answer is different than what you expect. All right, so you have your why, you know why you want to evaluate your initiative. Now, how do you move forward from there? There are really two major frameworks that are commonly used to evaluate your security initiative. Those are BSIMM and OpenSAMM. So those are the two I'm going to be talking about today. There are some other kind of minor efforts out there, but these are really the big ones. So OpenSAMM is a framework that is used to help organizations formulate and implement a strategy for software security. So it's tailored to specific risks facing the organization. This is an OWASP project, and the nice thing about it is it's all like open source, the community's opinions influence this. They have a lot of great templates that you can use to conduct an assessment. So all of those are really strong things. Current version is 1.5, but 2.0 is in beta. So that's supposed to be rolled out really soon. 1.5 is from 2017. That's the version I'm going to talk about because it's the officially released version, but there is a newer version coming out soon. Both of these models are released under Creative Commons, so I'm going to use some of the material from it. You can freely use the material, so that's something that's really nice about both of them. So the thing to take away from OpenSAMM, though, is this is a framework of best practices put together by a community of experts. So these are people out there who know about how security initiatives run and say, here's what this should look like. They give you some benchmarks for different kinds of organizations, has lots of great information. BSIMM. So BSIMM takes a totally different approach. Instead of being a bunch of experts telling you what they think you should be doing, it goes out there and says, what is the industry doing? So basically it goes out, this is BSIMM 10. For the last 10 years, they've gone out and said, it surveyed a number of organizations. This year, they're up to 122 and said, which of these activities are you performing? And then they collect all that data, organize it, give you different levels where, more common activities, less common activities. It's really just descriptive. This is not telling you this is what experts think you should be doing. Instead, it's saying, here's what the industry is doing today. So also great information, but comes at it from a totally different perspective. And there's an assumption built into this that if similar companies are performing this activity, it's a best practice. So to me, that's probably the weakest part of BSIMM. There's kind of this implicit assumption that, hey, people are doing it, must be a good idea. And I think in many cases that holds true, but I think as you're looking at BSIMM results, always keep that in mind, because sometimes industry is doing something that turns out not to be that great of an idea. All right, so the other thing is BSIMM is a study that was conducted and maintained by Cigital, which is now owned by Synopsys. So it's not quite as free and open. It's still under the Creative Commons license, but it's the company is the one that makes the decision about what goes into it, how the study's conducted, all of that stuff. They publish the data at high level, but they have lots of other data that you have to go subscribe to them in order to get access to. They have a conference, but again, you have to be paying Synopsys as your consultant in order to be participating in their conference, whereas OpenSAMM, you can go to participate in their Slack channel. They have sessions at some of the OWASP conferences, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the two different models. Let me dig a little bit deeper for you. So what do the frameworks look like? This is OpenSAMM. It has 4 different business functions: governance, construction, verification, operations. Under each of these business functions are several different security practices: strategy and metrics, policy and compliance, education and guidance, threat assessment, security requirements, security architecture, design review, implementation review, security testing, issue management, environment hardening, and operational enablement. When you do an OpenSAMM assessment, each of these areas has a series of guidelines underneath. So they'll have a series of questions about, are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? That allows them to assess what your maturity level in each of these different practice areas is. Let's really quickly compare this to how they've structured BSIMM. So you can see that, like OpenSAMM, BSIMM has 4 different major areas. They call them domains: governance, intelligence, SDL, touchpoints, and deployment. Underneath that are a bunch of practices that, again, all these kind of roughly map to OpenSAMM. So structure-wise, they're pretty similar. Underneath each of these practices, BSIMM has a bunch of activities. So they call them activities, specific items that they ask, are you doing this? And ultimately what BSIMM consists of is a list of those activities and yes, no's about whether each of these companies is performing that activity. All right, so just comparing again, they're very similar in structure, right? So you can see that they each have 4 major areas and then a bunch of sub areas that they've broken these down into. There's some differences, but ultimately they're pretty darn close. And that's what you'd expect, right? They're assessing basically the same thing. If they were hugely different, you'd wonder like what was going on. One of them would be off course for sure. All right, so how do you figure out which one of these to use if you want to assess your security initiative? That's a question we confronted, and so we kind of looked at like what makes them different, what's the same, and like I said, the biggest thing that's different is that they're really trying to do different things. BSIMM is trying to give you data about what's going on in the industry, and OpenSAMM is telling you what experts think you should be doing. BSIMM has some actual published data in their white paper saying, here's what we discovered. And OpenSAMM is more of, again, targets that they've set that they think are best practices. On the other hand, OpenSAMM has a bunch of templates that are ready to go that you can easily use to start assessing your organization. And then, they both have communities. The OpenSAMM community is a little bit more open. It's a little bit easier to access. And of course, you can do both. Right? So that was the answer we came to, that we like both of these. They have different information for us. We want to do both of them. We started with BSIMM because we wanted to get that assessment against the industry best practices that are going on now, but then our intention is to move into also do OpenSAMM and then compare and contrast, see what kind of differences come up there. We also then, once you figure that out, how do you figure out how to conduct the assessment itself? There's a couple different strategies. Like we looked at either bringing in a consultant and paying them to do this assessment. And then we looked at maybe doing it in-house too. And there's different ways you can approach the assessment. You can go into, if you're going to do it in-house, you can do it at a high effort kind of assessment where you're asking, a 600 question survey that really digs down into the meat of all of these activities to get very detailed results. You can conduct interviews, you can do an analysis, validate results with tests. That's the kind of thing that a consultant is likely to want to do if you bring them in. And you can do that in-house too. But you have other options. You can do a more moderate level effort, which would involve maybe a longer survey, but no interviews unless they're necessary. It would maybe not necessarily going back and testing and validating the results you're getting. Yes?
Are these specifically related to BSIMM?
It could be for either of them. OpenSAMM already has a model built up that with a set of questions, so you'd probably want to adhere to the existing model.
That was around like 80 or 90 questions total.
Yeah, so they do. So I agree with that. But I will say, and so this is more directly applicable to BSIMM. I think even for OpenSAMM, because they have that model that you may want to, a lot of the items on there, you may want to dig deeper to make sure the answers you're getting are accurate and ask the same question in different ways. So the reason why I'm saying that is we went and looked at what outside consultants do. We tried to get some surveys they've conducted, and a lot of them are much deeper than the basic one that OpenSAMM gives you. So, yeah. And I'll talk a little bit more about of that in a second. And then there's a lightweight approach, right? So you can do a lightweight approach, which is more like just ask the 100 question survey and send it out to some folks maybe, do some follow-up interviews as needed, analyze and report results. So we ended up doing this, so we kind of shifted strategies. Initially, our scope was to go out to other sister organizations and assess them as well as our own internal organization. And when we were going to do that, we were thinking more like this moderate level approach, because we'd going into outside organizations. And in that case, you want to ask the same questions different ways, maybe do more interviews, really gather data to make sure that they're answering the question in the way it's asked. Then we kind of downscoped and decided we'd do our internal organization first with the intent to later, maybe next year, start assessing other organizations. So we decided this more lightweight approach would work for us. All right, so let me move on. So that's how you might conduct the assessment. And I wanted to, because the question I always get at this point is people are curious about what kind of things are you going to find when you're doing your assessment of your organization. So there's tons of information in both of these models, and I highly recommend if you're interested in this, go out and read some of that material, even if you're not going to do the full analysis. Honestly, it's pretty interesting to see what kind of things other organizations are doing, what kind of things are kind of coming up. So I highly recommend that, but I can give you just kind of a little bit of sample of what to expect. So one of the things that BSIMM, for example, found in their data sets was that there's kind of this path that most organizations follow, and it's pretty similar for most organizations. An organization that's getting started kind of has these, in these major areas, structure, prioritization, and visibility. They kind of do the same things. They name someone who is the owner for the Software Security Initiative. That's what SSI stands for here. They generate some kind of awareness about security within the organization, and then they find some kind of peer within engineering who will also kind of own security. They figure out what their top 10 things to focus on are. So that might be bugs or attacks or whatever's most relevant to your organization. And they prioritize those. And then they select some initial controls to implement. Their next focus is on inventorying assets, so they need to know what they're really protecting out there. Some organizations, that's much harder to figure out than others. And doing defect discovery, determining which issues are out in production. What do they need to care about? So all this makes sense, and this is directly cribbed from BSIMM. They had this nice little checklist out there that shows that you really need to go through this kind of, make sure this is in place to get your SSI started. You need some leadership. You need to know your software, you need to figure out what's in scope for your effort. You want to make sure your host and network security is in place, because if that stuff's not out there, like I keep hearing, if you've been going to some of these sessions about the cloud, all of them start out by saying things like, I know this is an application security conference, but if you don't have your cloud infrastructure in place, then the application security doesn't matter. And I think that's true here. Figure out what kind of problems you have, select control, and repeat. So that's where most organizations start. Where do they go from there? From there, they start looking at really documenting and socializing their secure software development lifecycle. They start looking at balancing detective and preventative controls. And what that means is, folks start by saying, let's prevent problems. And that's, because that's their first, here's the fire. Let's go find that fire and put it out. Then they start getting to the point where they say, okay, how can we prevent these fires from happening, right? So let's push it to the left, figure out how we can build security into the process early on so we don't drive these vulnerabilities down at the end. So that becomes more of a focus. They start taking feedback from their incident response team and driving it back to development so that they, again, can prevent these problems from happening. And then this is a theme you're going to hear more. Security more integrated into or originating from engineering. So a lot of organizations start with this separate organization that's all about software security. And then what happens is engineering, the development teams start taking more and more ownership of security. It doesn't mean this centralized organization goes away. It's just that the responsibility gets shared. This is a really good thing. You see engineering, you see developers, you see architects, IT managers kind of really driving, okay, how can we make ourselves more secure? And I liked this quote from BSIMM because it kind of captures some of that evolution, right? Their observation is that engineering-led groups are starting with open source and homegrown security tools with much less reliance on these big box vulnerability discovery products. Generally, these groups hold to two heuristics, and I've seen this over and over again, right? Lengthening time to or preventing delivery is unacceptable. Instead, you have to organize to provide telemetry and then respond asynchronously through virtual patching, rollback, or other compensating controls. Build vulnerability detective capability incrementally, in line with a growing understanding of software misuse and abuse and associated business risk, rather than purchasing box security standards as part of a vendor's core rule set. So I thought that was an interesting quote, kind of captures that evolution. All right, so once you're kind of past maturing or really solid there, how do you optimize? They found that organizations that are trying to optimize start knowing what that top 10 risks or issues are, and they start driving them down. They relentlessly start saying, okay, here's our number one problem. Let's get rid of that one. Okay, what's number 2? Let's start driving that down. And they go down that list. Tool customization, so leaders start placing effort on tuning their tools, right? So to improve accuracy, consistency, and depth of analysis. We have the tools in place, now how do we use them better? Feedback loops. So that means you take relevant information from each part of your secure software development lifecycle and then feed it back to development. And then you start using data more effectively, capture metrics. Okay, so overall, like across, again, BSIMM's been produced for 10 years now. What kind of trends have they seen recently that have been things that weren't big in the past that maybe have become bigger more recently? Here are their top 3 areas that they see popping up. So first of all, Agile-friendly software security initiatives. I think anybody in organization, that most organizations out there are starting to say, hey, how do we become Agile, or we're Agile, how do we continue to do that? And then one of the big questions within security in general right now is how do we work with an Agile software development team and still make sure that they're producing software that meets the quality standards that we have? And that's a huge challenge. And one of the answers is DevSecOps, right? So as we automate our DevOps chain, we start asking, well, how do we make sure security is a piece of that automated DevOps chain? And then, here's the phrase again we talked about, engineering-led security. So that means it's bottom up from dev and operations. And again, here's these great quotes they had in there. Emerging engineering-driven groups tend to view security as an enabler of software features and code quality. These groups recognize the need for having security standards, but they tend to prefer governance as code. I love that idea, right? We're having infrastructure as code, now let's have governance as code, as opposed to manual steps with human review approach to enforcement, right? So in order to get security embedded in our chain, it needs to be automated, let's face it. Ultimately, we can't have people looking at all this stuff. We got to figure out how to make it more and more automated. This tends to result in engineers building security features and frameworks into the architectures, automating defect discovery techniques within a software delivery pipeline, and treating security defects just like any other defect. Traditional human-driven security decisions are modeled into software-defined workflow, opposed to written into a document and then implemented in a separate risk workflow handled outside of engineering. In this type of culture, it's not that the traditional SDLC gates and risk decisions go away, it's that they get implemented differently, and they usually have different goals compared to those of governance-driven groups. So I think this is a fascinating evolution that's being captured here in this model. I think it's hugely relevant to most organizations and something we need to figure out, we're in this kind of flux state where we're making the shift from governance-driven to engineering-driven, from these outside controls to automated, from this traditional waterfall model to more agile model. So that's pretty cool. All right, so what I'm going to show you, I was going to pull up some of the BSIMM activity to kind of get a sense of, get down into the meat of it and see what kind of questions they're actually asking. We can pull up the SAMM spreadsheet just to really see what it looks like. I did put both of these out here on the session site and schedule. The BSIMM survey is basically, it took the data and put it in a spreadsheet. So all of the activities they have, and then I added the percentage of the percentage of the total number of their respondents who were doing that activity. So it has a percent on there. It's kind of a quick way to get a sense of how you stack up against other organizations. Hold on a second, let me see if I can get that up for you. All right, so this is something I threw together myself. All the data is freely available on the BSIMM site, the BSIMM 10 package. I'm going to zoom in on this in just a second so we can read it better. I just want to talk about what this is, how it's laid out. So we have, at the top is just the title. So each of the domains we talked about are in blue. So we talked about 4 domains. This one's in governance. Each of the practice areas is in yellow. So this is under strategy and metrics. And then each of those practice areas has a number of activities, whatever number they have observed in their data as they collect it. And they also, like I said, they have all kinds of statistics about how many people, how many of the organizations are doing these. I took the percentage, and this is kind of just a rough way of evaluating kind of how your organization stacks up. And it's generally like more frequent to less frequent. So for example, 66.4% of the organizations were performing this activity. That might be something you guys would, if you aren't doing this, why not, right? I mean, I'd hope so. This is like one of the basic ones, but that kind of gives you an idea of what to look at and what not to look at. So if you were doing a quick BSIMM assessment in-house, you might take a survey like this and send it out to all of your software security initiative team. You might send it out to a couple of architects, developer maybe, to see what they think, how they think about it. So that's what we did. And the reason why we picked not just the security team, but also some folks outside of the security team, is we have an idea about what we're doing, but we wanted somebody outside of us to say, are they seeing that, right? Like some of these are about, are you communicating things out to the rest of the organization? And yeah, we think we are, right? We're like, yeah, we publish all our processes, we put all that stuff out there, we hold the lunch and learns, we do this session. But if we send the survey out to an architect or developer or an IT manager or whoever, and they say, well, no, I've never heard of that, well, that's really good information for us, right? That's it's almost like a customer survey. Are you getting the message we're sending out to you? So we did that. Let me zoom in on here, so how this works. Let me get a little bit closer so you can see what it looks like. All right, so there are activities here on the left. First one, for example, is publish process and evolve as necessary. Now, so they have this kind of short summary, but be sure you read the full description because it gives a lot of detail about exactly what do they mean by that. When they go out and they do this survey, how do they figure out if an organization is doing this activity? They have to meet the criteria in this description. And when I was talking about doing like a longer 600 question survey, it would be pulling out like each of the criteria in the more detailed section and asking those. So you wouldn't just ask the team, are we publishing processes and evolving as necessary? Instead, you'd get in here and you'd say, you'd be, the process for addressing software security is published. So you'd ask something like, is it published? Is it broadcast to all stakeholders so that everybody knows the plan, et cetera? Are your goals, roles, responsibilities, and activities explicitly defined? Right, so it goes, if you're not doing all of those things, you don't get a yes on this activity. If you're doing kind of some of them, sort of. So on BSIMM, it's really a yes or no kind of survey. So you could come over here, and like I said, this is out on my sessions page, so you're welcome to take it and use it as you want. It's all open shared licensing. So you'd select yes or no. And again, if you were a no here and 66% of the organizations are a yes, that's kind of something to look at. It's not necessarily bad. Some of these everybody else might be doing, but your organization doesn't need to do it. And that's okay too. It's really just a discussion point. So another next question, for example, is create evangelism role and perform internal marketing, right? And if you're kind of like, what is that? Like, what's the evangelism role, right? And there's more detail in the white paper, but there's also just a better description here of what that means, right? To build support for your software security throughout the organization, somebody in the software security group must play an evangelism role, right? Somebody goes out there and performs a marketing function, helps keep executives and other stakeholders up to date on the magnitude of the software security problem and elements of its solution. Right? So for our organization, for example, we do have somebody who does that, and I'd probably say yes. 54% of the organizations do. So it goes through line by line. Next one, is, for example, is educate executives, right? And this one's an interesting one. Executives are periodically shown the consequences of inadequate software security and the negative business impact it can have on the organization. And it goes into more detail. And for example, this one, I don't know that we do this consistently, right? So I might say no. And this would be something to look at then because 59.8% of organizations said they were doing this. So that's the value of this, and it goes through, again, like I said, there's 120 activities within the BSIMM framework. You can go through line by line, read all the details. Again, it's useful information even if you don't go do the full assessment. So that's kind of BSIMM. SAMM has a different approach to things. So this is and again, they have lots of templates and other material out in the full package, out at the link that is in the presentation. But this is their core package. This is their assessment toolbox. And their approach, And I really like this approach too. So this is a pretty interesting, and it's, like I said, complementary. I think both of these are very valuable. They have this spreadsheet already set up for you. It's an interview spreadsheet, and it takes each of these items under each of the different sections and says, is there a software security assurance program in place? And there's guidance about what that means. So assurance program is documented and accessible to the staff. Assurance program has been used in recent development efforts. Staff receives training against assurance program and responsibilities. And then your answer, instead of being yes, we're doing it, or no, can be a little bit more nuanced. Yes, it's less than a year old. Yes, it's a number of years old. Yes, it's a pretty mature program. So we might say, yeah, we're doing it, but it's only been like a year we've been doing this. Next question is, are development staff aware of future plans for the assurance program? Assurance program goals are documented and accessible to staff. Assurance program goals have been presented to staff. A plan has been put in place to reach those goals in a specific period of time. And we might look at that and say, yes, small percentage, yes, at least half, yes, majority. So I would say maybe yes, at least half. That seems reasonable. And then you can come a little bit farther down, and you can see for this particular area, there's three questions. The third one is, do the business stakeholders understand your organization's risk profile? And it gives you some nuanced answers, and we'll say yes, at least half of them are or do. And you can see as you're selecting these, it automatically produces a rating. It's kind of like a percentage, right? It's kind of roughly equivalent to what percentage are you doing this. So as you select answers that are more mature, you'd get a higher rating. You could get up to a 1, and as you select the lower answers, it's a lower rating. So that's kind of nice. It's all set up to automatically calculate that for you. But in addition, it has this cool scorecard. It copies all of that information into this scorecard, which allows you to see, how mature you are in each of these different areas. Right? It has this spider chart here. As you fill in the whole interview, it'll fill in the spider chart. And your phase 4 maturity score. So phase 4. Let me move on here, because the other neat thing about this is that it has a roadmap. So the great thing about this is you can see where you are now, right? Here's your current state. And then you can also set up a roadmap. You can say, hey, we know where we are now. Where do we want to be in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, whenever that might be. Maybe these are years, right? You can say we are at a 0.4 here, but by phase 4, we want to be at a 1.0, right? Or whatever that is. And so that's nice because it very clearly maps back to specific activities you need to be doing, and you can check yourself along the way to see, are you hitting these targets or are you not hitting these targets? And that can be extremely useful. All right, so that is the basics of BSIMM and OpenSAMM. Like I said, there's tons more out there. I'm not going to go into a great deal in this session because there's just too much out there. But let me stop for a minute. If you need to get a hold of me later on, first of all, email if you want to get a hold of me. But right now, let me see if there are any questions or anything else I could delve into for you.
Where did you say those templates are? You mentioned there's somewhere on a site.
Yeah. So there's a site for this session, right, where you go out and you can rate the session and all that kind of stuff. And there's also the presentations are out there.
Okay.
It's all out there. Yep, should be.
So they're attached in with the presentation?
Yeah, I put it out with that. So let me see if I. No. I don't have it open. Maybe no. Okay. There we go. Yeah, I put them all out here. Yep, the presentation. So, yep. And again, this is just this one is that one's one I made. So that's and again, it's just supplementary to the BSIMM material that's out there. This is just basically copied and pasted from the SAMM work. They have a zip file with this toolbox and some other materials. So you can certainly get that same file from them as well. Yep.
Okay. Now you said that y'all chose to do both. Is that correct?
We did, yes.
Have y'all completed both of them?
We haven't. We finished the BSIMM portion of it, and I'm more familiar with that. We are just starting into the SAM portion, so we're going to probably do that over the next 6 months, depending on resource.
In-house, or are you getting consultants to do it?
That's a good question. So we ended up doing both of them in-house initially, but we probably, we'll probably bring in consultants in 6 months to a year and kind of compare and contrast results. So we decided to kind of take both approaches. We were interested in, first of all, getting it done now, but also seeing how the results differed as well. We want to, first of all, be able to show where we stack up against industry right now and against best practices. So we want to understand, we think we have a good sense of where we're at relative to the industry, but it's great to have that hard data from the outside so that we're just validating our own assumptions. But in addition, again, we have people, some people in leadership who, don't always trust our view of what kind of resources we need, where we need to be investing. So we want to have the evidence to show them that the direction we think we need to head is the right direction. Or if the results show it's not the right direction, maybe that's a good question for us. Maybe we're wrong about where we think we need to go. And then the end result is definitely going to be a roadmap, maybe very much kind of like the OpenSAMM map we just showed, where here's where we're at, here's our current benchmark, here's where we'd like to go long term. But we'd like to validate that against more than one model. So it's taken us a while, but a lot of that's resource availability. Honestly, something like this tends to, if you have a busy development shop, this is going to get pushed down to a lower priority. It just is. And that can be okay depending on your urgency. For us, it's taken quite a while to get it going. I would say that you could do this in a couple of months if you wanted to. If you really need to devote a little time to just reading the material, understanding it, putting together your assessment materials. That's going to be a good chunk of time. That could be done in a couple weeks if you had the resources to devote to it. Then you need to, it's really getting the feedback from people can be a challenge. People's time is always tight. Again, we are in the process of doing another set of surveys, and it's just so hard to get people to complete these and get them back in any kind of timely manner because they all have other things going on. So, if you allocate a couple more weeks for that, the part that really I think should take the most time is evaluating your results and compiling them into a coherent kind of white paper, because you want to make sure you're making good recommendations, right? Understanding the data you're getting back, maybe going back and doing follow-up interviews if needed. One of the things we're finding is when we have very discrepant results, right? So when one person's saying, yes, we're doing this, and then you have two more people saying, no, we are not doing this. The real value is in getting some of those people together and saying, okay, let's understand why you thought we were doing this and you didn't. Yeah, that's really for our organization, it is ultimately owned by the VP of our division. So we've gotten that kind of ownership from him because for the reasons you're talking about, there needs to be accountability, not just for completing it, but also for following up on the results. So we have gone up to, it depends on how your organization's structured, right? I could see it, if you have a CISO type role, it could be under that kind of role. So we do have our developers under a different manager than our security team, and we have different IT managers over different development groups. That's something we have. So our strategy was, we went up to the VP who's over all of those people. That was important to us. We needed to get buy-in from somebody who had control, who has influence over all of the folks we'd need support from. That was number one. I don't know if we could have done, it would have been effective if we hadn't done that. We did take an approach of doing, just sending out a questionnaire first. And then, because it's just hard, we wanted it to be as low effort as possible to start with, right? So we decided, because at first we're like, oh yeah, we're gonna totally interview all these people, we're gonna do all of this, and we could have done that, but I think we wanted to get better buy-in, so we're like, no, you know what, let's take let's just send you here, it's just it's only gonna take an hour or so, 2 hours maybe, here's 100 questions, you can answer 100 questions, can't even get it back to us. With the intent then to, if we needed to go farther, you can always go back and say, hey, that questionnaire you submitted, we're gonna do a little follow-up, it's gonna take another half an hour, that's all. And you're likely to get more buy-in if you kind of ease into that, is my experience. As far as writing, we're still finishing up the writing of the final report, but that's probably the piece that we're investing the most in. Like I said, I think that we wanna, every once in a while we still run across something we're not sure of, and it's great because we're in-house, we're doing our own organization, so we can easily go back and ask a question to follow up and get better answers for. That would be a challenge if you were trying to do another organization that you were outside of, right? So that's something we were challenged by, yeah. Right. We're in the process of doing that. It's and you know, it's just, some of that we were doing anyway. Let me just say, this assessment in some sense is validating some of the paths we were on anyway. We are for sure working very hard to integrate security into our project requirements early on. That has been, you know, in addition to this, one of the activities I've been very actively involved in, and it's a huge challenge. Right now we're still at a place where it's a lot of hand-holding to get them to do that. So we're at the stage we're at now is kind of like, hey, you guys, as soon as you start thinking about planning a project or a release, like, let us know as soon as possible. Submit this JIRA ticket to us immediately as soon as that happens. And we're at a place where we're like trying to validate that. We're like, hey, you updated this release calendar, but you didn't submit a ticket to the security team. What's the deal? Maybe you should go talk to them. And it's really a lot of kind of like getting them into that mindset right now. And the hope is we're going to get them to that point where it's not going to be that kind of hand-holding anymore, but it's still there. I think that's an interesting alternate approach. Like, some of the material I read suggested doing that after you do the survey, kind of like you get survey results. Okay, now go see if your data backs up what the survey results said, right? But another way would be, hey, maybe we don't need to survey somebody if we can get the data from JIRA or wherever. That'd be a great point, yeah. Yeah, you could do that. Yeah, you could do that. You could set up maybe even a monthly meeting or a weekly, you know, half-an-hour meeting. Let's get together and answer a few of these questions together, guys, that kind of thing. And then you won't have to just spend an hour on your own filling out that kind of stuff. That might work. I think there's lots of approaches to get the data from people that is kind of sneaky. Like, that's become a surprisingly large part of my job, is figuring out how to sneakily get people to answer the questions I need answered. So I like those ideas. Yeah. Yeah, so that's something we really talked about, because you know, that's one reason people bring in consultants, right? They just don't trust that an internal team is going to get an honest answer. And so we really thought about, like, because we, especially because initially we were doing it, and we were like, we still want to do it in-house. And part of that is, you know, making sure that you're, again, getting answers from different people, different roles in the organization. I think that's very helpful. If there are even knowledgeable people outside the organization, that might be helpful too, getting lots of different viewpoints. That way, if your own intuition, if you have an intuition about an answer and one of those people says something different, well, figure that out. I think that can be real helpful. Something we were just talking about is just validating your results too. Some of these things you can actually go back and, you know, they're saying, oh yeah, we have this process that we all know about. Well, go look. Is anybody reading that process? Are they following that process? That kind of thing. Get some data to support at least some of these. And that's pretty common. So some of the BSIMM results was that, like, they do things like that. Ask how many developers do you have, how many people in your AppSec team, and that's pretty common, unfortunately. Yeah. We're trying to be enablers rather than blockers, right? Instead of saying, oh no, you can't go because security, we're trying to say, okay, yes, and, right? So yes, you deliver several times a day, and we're gonna integrate security into that. We're gonna make that easier for you, less of a blocker, and like, hey, let's work together, figure out how to make that something that's integrated in what you do. So, and I know that's a long-term answer, right? Because you can't do that overnight, because that means automation, that means things like making sure people are, well-trained, so they're thinking about security at every single step, that kind of stuff, all the DevSecOps stuff that you hear in but again, that is the answer, but it's the long-term answer. The short-term answer is you still have to have controls, right? But you also have to ask, what are your exceptions to those controls, okay? So, and what do you do to compensate for those exceptions? So yes, we're gonna let you go into production, but that means you must do, this scan immediately after production, or you must get a pen test at this point to make sure that there was nothing that we missed in this, or we need to make extra sure that you're doing secure code reviews on your application. You need to make sure you're 100% sure you're documenting those, or bringing in someone from the outside to do that. Whatever that may be, I think there's a negotiation there, right? We have a whole set of things, a whole toolbox of things we can use to secure code. And maybe some of them are gonna fit into a quick turnout if you're releasing several times a day. Some of them have to be more in parallel and just aren't gonna be able to be done with every release. And we need to figure out if that's okay, when that's okay, and that somebody's accepting the risk for that if it's happening. So I agree, it's a challenge, right? I don't know that there's an easy answer, unfortunately. Yeah, tools, automation really is the answer. We need to get all this, I know a lot of teams, we're just rushing to kind of automate this stuff. Let's put it, put governance as code, right? That's the way they keep talking about. It's the only way to do it fast enough. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. All right. Anything else you guys got? Thank you. And thank you guys for sticking around. I know it's getting late on Friday and all that stuff. You could have snuck out a little early and you didn't, so I appreciate that. Thank you.